Welcome everybody to ARC's webinar. This is a special webinar on topics around the coronavirus and the impact that we think that the situation currently around the world will have on automation markets and supply chains. My name is David Humphrey. I'm an analyst with ARC based here in Munich. My colleague Florian Gulder is here as well. Florian, want to say hello?
Hello everyone, this is Florian speaking.
We're going to take about a half an hour to present some information on some recent research we've done. This originally started as the annual forecast development for some of our market research in the area of automation. And suddenly we were impacted by a black swan that sailed into our pond. This is the coronavirus. It's obviously having an effect around the world, and we want to share a couple thoughts with you. During the course of the next half an hour, we're going to use the polling function of our webinar tool to ask 4 questions at 4 different times to get a spontaneous response from the attendees on a couple of different aspects of how the coronavirus is affecting your company. At the very end of the webinar, we'll have room for question and answer. So if you have a question, you can formulate the question and type it into the chat area, or I'm sorry, the question area of the webinar tool at any time. We'll see it right away, and we'll queue it up for the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. And finally, after the webinar, all of the attendees who joined our webinar today will receive these slides. Some of the slides have a lot of text on them. There's a lot to read, so we're not going to cover that in detail in the webinar. It'll be for later reading at your leisure. The first question in the polling that we'd like to find out is to give us your spontaneous response to what you think the state of mind is in your company regarding the COVID-19 virus, otherwise known as Corona. If you just click on one of the responses, we'll record that. Is your company state of mind relaxed? Is it optimistic? Is it nervous? Or are you in a state of panic? And if you just take a couple of seconds to vote, we'll tally it up and we'll have an instant result that we can share with everybody. I'm watching the polls as they come in. Thank everybody for your quick response. We're at 3/4 already, 73%. Florian, that's fine. I think we can show the results.
Close the poll, 3, 2, 1, and closed. And the results are here.
Okay, that doesn't surprise me. Florian and I discussed the results before, what we thought might come out, and we doubted that anybody would be overtly optimistic. Optimistic, yes, maybe that things are going to end once a vaccine and a solution for the problem is in sight. It doesn't surprise me at all that the majority of people are nervous. That's what we hear from our clients. That's what we hear from end users around the world. Yeah, that's a pretty good snapshot of the state of mind.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's also quite similar to what we have seen in our morning session just a couple of hours ago. And yeah, people in Europe and in Asia, and the current session is more US centric or America centric. So Europe and Asia, people are nervous. Before we continue, let's just do a quick, comment from my side. I've personally visited New Orleans just briefly after Hurricane Katrina, saw the brown line, saw houses that were left alone and that were cleared by troops and everything. We don't want to sound cynical here in the next half an hour or so. We all know that the impacts on society, on families and everyone is much more severe and much more important to something than our little small niche called the automation market. So we are aware of that. We don't want to really sound cynical by just leaving out any sort of social aspects or aspects in terms of society. Well, and now back to our little niche, the automation market. And this is a snapshot with as is data from goes up to Q4 2019 actually, and it shows the status quo that we had back then. And actually things were not looking bad in Q4. Process industries were actually sort of flattening out from a couple of boom years. not doing overly well, but robust. Hybrid markets grew in, so pharmaceutical and food and bev grew in their single digits, all good. Discrete were basically coming out of a trough, or it reached the bottom of a trough because automotive was down, and then electronics and semiconductors were already flattening out, starting to grow again. And it all looked like it would be a not so brilliant 2020, and probably with some more growth growth dynamics starting to in mid 2020. But then Corona came, and everything has changed, and all our lovely forecasts have turned out to be outdated within a couple of weeks. And turning to Corona, we have the next question. So
Yeah.
please,
Before
yeah,
we get to the numbers, if you just take a minute or so to vote on to let us know whether your company has a contingency plan currently at all. Is it under development? Is it a work in progress? Is it prepared? Is it prepared and has it been communicated to the staff already? Or is it already out there and are measures being taken to compensate for example, the problem of the workforce being able to get to work, people working in home office, etc.
mm,
Please just give us an idea of what your company is doing. Again, wow, we're at 2/3 of the total attendees. Okay, that was fast. It's going up pretty quickly. Florian, you can stop at any time you like.
all right. Again, 3, 2, 1, and closed. And the results are here.
Okay, I would say that's kind of a mixed batch across
Mhm.
the different answers. It seems that most companies seem to be in the early stages of developing and preparing, but a higher number uh, in our afternoon session today than the morning session
Yeah,
appears to have a plan already in place and running.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That surprises me a bit. And by the way, when you receive the final slides from us after the webinar, we are actually consolidating the responses from the morning and afternoon session, and next to the questions, you'll get the results as well. All right. So Friday 13th day with Back to Corona.
Okay. Um, there we go. As I mentioned, we were just going about our annual business, our routine of creating forecasts for the new year by region, by industry, the way we do our daily work. When in January along came the coronavirus. What is the coronavirus? I'm not going to go into detail about it. There's so much in the news right now. I'm a news junkie myself. Um, Florian, if you can switch to the next slide. I've listed a number of basic facts about it, but these are really all overblown. We've just been bombarded with news. We're all experts to this degree on the coronavirus. So let's move on right to the next slide. We've updated this slide to show you uh, obviously where the coronavirus has hit hard. Obviously in the darker countries, it's creeping across the globe, going from east to west mostly. Um, in the lighter colored areas, eventually the whole world will be affected. It's not going to be contained by any country. We know that countries aren't trying to contain it anymore. They're trying to win time. They're trying to slow the spread in order to prevent the medical healthcare facilities from being overwhelmed by a huge amount of the population being infected suddenly. Um, let's move on in the interest of time, Florian, and get to the good stuff. To our next question is how big do you think the impact of coronavirus will affect your business? Just take a couple of seconds and try to imagine in the ranges that we provided how you think your revenue in 2020, in the current year, will be impacted. Do you think it'll be no impact, little impact? We put in ranges from we think it's going to go down. There's no plus unless you're selling face masks. Um, Ranges of about 15%. So 0 to -15, -15 to -30, 30 to -50, or worse than -50. And if you can remember, this is all anonymous. We're not going to hold you on these numbers. This is just to get a group snapshot of the attendees today and how you think Corona is going to affect your business this year. So again, this is a very dynamic group. Thanks for voting pretty quickly. It's really interesting to share these snapshot poll results with you. Let's take a look and see what people said. Again, Florian, I think you agree with me. This agrees with our forecast as well, which we'll show you in a second. Florian, your comments?
Yeah, it's I think it's slightly more optimistic than we had in our morning session, because here there's a clear spike, 0 to 15%. We had a couple of more with minus 30 to 15% in our morning session. Yeah, and yeah, it will have an impact. There are a couple of responses saying no impact, but we probably have to dig deeper into the answers and from which sector those are coming. Again, if you sell face masks or hand sanitizers, it's probably a good year. All right. And I was quite nervous when we put that in there, because the next slide, as you can see it now, that shows our estimate. So it's a very brief summary, and afterwards we talk a little bit more about the details of the finding as well as how we got there. On the left side here, you'll see the millions of US dollars. Those are automation markets. So everything from sensors and actuators up to the software layers. We basically stop right below ERP there. PLM is, however, included. What we also included here is power. So any sort of electric power generation as well as distribution markets, because they are very special and they are very big. They have a big impact on the market. And we also include the like non-industrial markets. So we focus to key manufacturing and industry. And on the right side, you see the growth rates associated with it. And I said it before, we did those scenarios around 2.5 weeks ago, and by now, most certainly the green line, which you barely see, is completely unrealistic, because it's far too optimistic, and most people settle around 15% growth, which would be right between the two scenarios. So in this area, which I highlight right now here. Overall, doing a couple of weeks of analysis here, we came to the conclusion that it's most likely be followed with a quick catch-up in 2021. But it will cause a huge loss to automation markets overall, summing it up in US dollars. Again, more details to follow, but the interesting thing is how did we end up there? And what we did is we looked at value chains and supply chains. We looked at some of the past crises, and the first things we really took a deeper look at is like how are value chains affected. And this is a very easy and simple example of a t-shirt production. You have automation equipment from Germany. It gets built into the machine in Switzerland, machine shipped to Turkey to make the fabric. It's dyed in China, soon in Bangladesh, and then sold in US. There are a lot of things that can go wrong during that supply chain during the production process. And obviously, the tighter integrated these supply chains are, the more vulnerable they get. If the Chinese part of the value chains just stocks fabric worth for a couple of months of production, they can continue on for quite some time before they receive any problems on their side. And obviously, also if the fabric manufacturer from Turkey has a very broad set of machineries, then it's very diversified from his side, and also very diversified set of customers in China for the dyeing. Then it gets more stable, because you can have strategies to bypass if one of the companies or your suppliers or your customers drops out. And also there are a couple of supply chains which are very consolidated. I would say one of the best examples is often cement, because they just excavate, crush, burn, and do everything in one go. So it's obviously very vulnerable to that specific plant if something happens there. Now, what we then did to support our analysis and our thinking is this matrix of integration and diversification. It's for us, it was really a sort of rough framework to guide our thinking, and obviously, and we'll come back to that in a bit, is the supply chains which have a low diversification and very tight integration. And examples for that are automotive, electronics, and semiconductors, where there are often just one or two companies that manufacture given plants, parts of the supply chain in one or two different plants. And there's a lot of just in time, it's very lean. So yes, that makes it quite vulnerable. There are others, such as aerospace and defense, where you have a very high, very specialized companies, but often it's not so deeply integrated, and there is it's not that much just-in-time manufacturing. You have a little bit more buffer there. On some markets, I mentioned cement before. Cement is very focused regionally or locally, actually, because of a single cement plant. But you have a lot of cement plants out there manufacturing, producing, and then shipping. So it's very integrated, but very diversified, and they don't depend on each other. And then parts of the food and beverage and parts of the machinery markets could be described as highly diversified and loosely integrated. So these would be the most robust markets. That was the supply side on one side, but then also the demand side. And in brief, it basically comes down to income elasticity. So like goods for daily life, food, pharma, things like that, they have a very low income elasticity, and it doesn't really matter. You're gonna purchase them. And right now here in Germany, especially we're running out of pasta and toilet paper to some extent. Then you have the cyclical products like cars, which you buy every 2, 3, 4, 10 years. Obviously, these purchases you're gonna postpone until you are secure about the financials and everything. We have countries such as the US where the available income depends a bit more on dividends and stock markets than in for example, in Europe. You have also one, let's say, almost positive impact on demand. So right now, credit, the interest rates are very low if you, for example, want to buy property. And the central banks are obviously pushing it further to support the economy. And there is another aspect where we already touched base on, and this is basically moving from Chinese to be more global. We already saw that in some of the Southeast Asian countries where that do depend on Chinese tourism over Chinese New Year's, etc. Basically, those income has just disappeared for this year. So on the demand side, you really have to, again, vertical by vertical by vertical, see what's pulling, what's pushing. And after we have talked about, let's say, the general dynamics, and before we go into some of the more detailed analysis, we would like to ask you another question about challenges of your company. David?
The polls are open again. Of the challenges we give you to select, what are the challenges you would say are facing your company? In this case, please just select one of them. We have another question coming up where you can select multiple answers. But do you see a drop in demand as being the greatest challenge? Sourcing certain parts or intermediate goods? Do you see a problem with employees not being able to make it to work or getting sick and half of your workforce being missing? Or do you see, besides supply chain stuff, problems with simple inbound and outbound logistics? So please take a minute or so to vote. Again, the votes are running in. It's like the primary season right now. We'll let it go a couple more minutes and a couple more seconds. And Florian, you can stop at any time you like.
All right, I'll closed, and here are the results.
Okay, that's the morning results were actually a little bit more skewed in another direction, but
Sure.
spontaneously, my feeling is that a dropping demand, as Florian pointed out, with a couple of things on the demand side, uh, uh, people freeze up, they delay purchase decisions. This is probably one of the biggest things that to face most companies, the fact they're not going to be selling a lot of product. Hopefully that'll be taken up again in about a year when we're out of this crisis. The remaining answers are all part of, or they're all in single digit areas, actually. They're a much smaller result.
All right.
All right,
Okay.
let's move on.
Yeah. So let's keep on. Here we actually looked at a couple of past crises from the supply side, on the value chain side, and what happened back then. We're gonna just quickly talk about it and then move to the results. Again, you're gonna receive them for your own reading afterwards. So we had the SARS crisis of early 2000s. By then, actually, the number of cases in China is already 10 times higher. And back then, China was not that well integrated into the global value chain. It was very early in their industrialization process. We looked at Katrina, which did damage and destroy around 20% of US oil production. So that was a significant shock, actually. We looked at the Tohoku earthquake of 2011, the Fukushima catastrophe, where actually a big share of the semiconductor production was affected and did have impact globally, as well as on automotive plants were also affected along the complete coastline. We had a terrible flood in Thailand in the very same year, which actually impacted around 25% of the world production hard disk drive by then. It was a very local shock, but it had an impact on global markets. And we had MERS, a very deadly, nasty beast of virus with a very high fatality rate, impacting Korea as well as the Middle East, but actually was really focused in terms of overall cases. It was quite low. And when we looked at these past crises and impacts, we can actually say that the supply side really was able to rebound very quickly, even though a lot of the disasters that we mentioned actually destroyed the assets. So that was very quickly to rebound. In the wake of those crises, a couple of companies, especially from automotive, has restructured their parts of the value chain to be more diversified and more robust. We saw disasters trigger long-run changes to supply chain, again, automotive, but also Fukushima and Katrina led to rise of shale gas, as well as the green and renewable energies in Europe. The chemical industry was quite reluctant to change so far. We always saw a price increase in electronic components. I think we see that already, even though we currently don't have any data. Panic has led to self-fulfilling prophecies, especially during the SARS virus. And demand can be very severely impacted if spending is postponed, as well as simply drops. We noticed that earlier. And honestly, when we looked at that, disruptions of around 3 months or less don't really have an impact. You cannot measure them on an annual basis. Okay. And then we move further to the supply side. So we looked at end user demand. That this all was part of our scenarios that we did. So we looked at the end user demand here. It's very important to distinguish between greenfield, brownfield investments, and also then of course MRO, maintenance, repair, and operations on the brownfield side, which is more stable and you cannot postpone it forever. We looked at the machinery demand because especially machine builders are important for automation as they sell and then basically resell. So for example, DMG Mori closed production for a couple of days, and obviously that also hits automation demand. And when you look at the map that we showed earlier, a lot of the machinery building countries are affected by now. We considered the supply side, so we all the automation companies of the world, do they have experienced problems with sourcing parts? Do they have own facilities affected? Is the staff affected? We looked at the outbound supply chain as well as the distributors. Distributors are very important because they tend to destock as soon as they feel something going on. So they add a lot of volatility in both directions, down as well as up. That's very important. Self-fulfilling prophecies and panic. Very hard to quantify, but we try to include that somehow. We considered the individual verticals, and I think we've explained that already, how we see the demand and supply side and integration, as well as the diversification of the individual verticals. And again, these are the results. So we used our standard market scenario methodology, and again, I see as of now the economy or the automation markets to lead more to this, let's say, global pandemic throughout 2020 curve that will, but with a quick rebound. And the big question is then, will we have a heavy, long global shutdown, which also looks at the demand side, or more where demand side is more impacted, or do we actually have also a structural disruption? I'll skip the first two because again, I see them as being very optimistic from current point of view. This one shows really, it assumes that the COVID-19 will impact supply side throughout 2020. So we will have problems in sourcing parts. We have challenges in supply chains. A larger number of factories need to stop or slow down productions. And also the financial market will have the impact on the supply side. But again, in this scenario, it does not assume we're getting into big demand side impacts. The big demand side impacts, which we from the consumer side, mass unemployment, real drop in available income, things like that. So in this side, we are still talking about the supply side shock, which is a very brief dip and then a recovery. And you'll see that here, basically that would mean from an automation perspective, we'll basically be back on track next year. Now, a longer shutdown means things such as, in Germany, we call that Kurzarbeit, short work weeks. Now, the state covers for some of your income loss, but you will have lower income. I mentioned the US earlier, where more income depends on stock markets. And so really the demand side, the consumers are really impacted because it takes a significant longer time. That again, it will roughly be the shape of the financial crisis that hit the automation markets in 2009 and had. So we all remember this. So this is already something we don't want to be into. And the very last one is structural disruption. Structural disruption means it's during that sharp drop, there is something gets really destroyed. And this could be the small specialty company that builds whatever automation solution that is necessary for machines that later can't run and that then can't produce, or a tier 2 supplier for automotive gets bankrupt. And there are a lot of discussions about this already in China, where small and mid-sized enterprises are not having a very big backlog as well as a buffer in terms of credit, so not running low on capital. And it also can affect the logistics. Logistics is one of the verticals or branches that are really impacted, because if you don't produce, you don't need to ship, and then they're missing revenues very quickly. That means It can be that even while you start, you will be able to restart your production. You don't have the company to ship your products. Now for t-shirts, that's probably quite easy to find another one to ship it from A to B. If you're producing crushers for the mining industry or larger capital equipment or large machines, oh, that is a problem. So if you need to watch the logistics as well, because if you cannot get your produced equipment out of your own factory, you'll have a big problem. Overall, that means after the ramp up of the COVID-19 has serious struggle. And that means we have a longer run impact, we lose productivity, and we actually lose global welfare. I personally sort of convinced we are not running into that. I'm personally seeing us somewhere between global pandemic and heavy and long global shutdown, because China is already firing up some of the plants again. Of course, in Europe, we're just seeing the beginning of the crisis, but the first measures are already taken. And I'm not talking about just major soccer events being cancelled. Schools and universities get shut down. Italy is basically staying at home, and also Germany and France are following that. So again, I personally convinced we're not running into that structural disruption scenario. David. David?
All right. Yeah. Can you advance the slide? I've got to see what comes. Okay. Florian, thanks for your insight and sharing those scenarios. Scenarios are interesting. In times of uncertainty, it doesn't make sense to forecast a single line. It's best to capture a lot more information and what if situations by creating scenarios. That's why we like to use our scenario tool in cases like this. Before we get to Q&A, I just want to point out that ARC is continuing with our industry events, even though most events and pretty much everything in daily life is being canceled. We are in the process of converting our European Industry Forum to a virtual forum that is going to be actually a pretty exciting thing. I'm personally responsible for the agenda, and we're creating an online forum that will take place on the same dates in May 18th to the 20th. It won't take place in Spain anymore. It will take place at your desktop. But we have, for the most part, all of the speakers, all of the panelists that agreed to attend our physical event will be in the virtual event as well. So we look forward to that. And as far as our next forums in India and Japan go coming up, we'll see what happens with them. We have a bit more time, and we have the luxury of waiting to see what will happen. Thank you to, first of all, to you, Florian, for your great research and being so proactive in putting together this and a special webinar that's not part of our normal series. And I'd like to thank the attendees as well for joining us. Have a great weekend, and don't forget to wash your hands.